Good morning. Welcome to the Vineyard. Little commotion up front with these chairs that are theater style. Hey, good morning, guys. Welcome to the Vineyard today. So good to see you. My name is Joel. I'm one of the pastors here, and super excited to be able to share with you today. We are glad that you are here with us. Today we're continuing a series that we've been in for several weeks now. We are going through the story of Joseph from the Old Testament book of Genesis. And what a story it has been if you've been with us. It's a story filled with dreams and detours and disappointments and even what we can call divine appointments, where we begin to experience God at work doing supernatural and amazing things, even in unexpected ways. And so it's been a really rich season, and it's been a joy to be able to journey through Joseph with you guys. We have several more weeks in this series, and we want to invite you to remain and be a part. Today is a time when I really feel like we're all going to find ourselves in some of this story, because it's about something that I think is very familiar with all of us. It's about waiting. Does anyone like a good wait? We hate to wait. We hate to wait. In fact, I think we're people, if you're like me, we pride ourselves on how quickly we can move. We like to go fast, right? We love same-day delivery. Next day is even too long now. We skip through all the ads on YouTube because who has time for those? I even saw a book last week called 1 Minute Bedtime Stories, condensed for the busy parent. We can't stand waiting. I mean, if Wi-Fi is even lagging like 3 seconds, we begin to throw a fit. The other day I was in my office upstairs, because I have an office right upstairs, and next door to me is our lead pastor, Josh. And we were just working, doing our thing. I'm working, he's working. And then suddenly I hear this noise coming out of his office. It's like, "Ugh!" It's like, whoa, what's happening to Josh? And then I waited a second, and it happened again. He was like, "Ugh!" And that time it was more painful. I was like, Josh, I better go check on him. What's going on? But then he gave it away. He's like, "Oh, Apple, why is this software update taking so long?" He was updating his computer, and he was in ultimate misery because this 5-minute update was killing him. But it was long, and it was more like 30 minutes, and it's something that we all hate going through in our lives. But we really hate to wait. I hate when I'm behind an accelerator challenge driver at a green light, or when it takes 3 minutes to go, it takes 30 minutes rather to go 3 miles. No, not good. I hate to wait. I hate to be in line. Those are types of waiting, though, that we all just have to deal with. It's just part of life. First world problems, worried about Wi-Fi lagging, whatever. But then there's a different type of waiting that's way more intense. And it's the kind of waiting that can be like excruciating in us. It's the waiting of a single person wondering, does God have marriage for me? And years go by. It's the waiting of a married couple who are longing to be parents and longing to have children. And they're praying and they're trying, and yet month after month, they're not pregnant. And they're wondering, God, what are you doing? I'm waiting for this. This is something I really want. There's the waiting of a relationship to be reconciled, maybe an estranged son or daughter or mom or dad. There's the waiting of healing in a body that could be sick or just in a really broken place. Or maybe it's the waiting in a job, like you're waiting for a breakthrough in a job, in a situation that you've been longing for because you feel kind of stuck and you have vision for something greater. It's those types of waiting, that not the trite kind like I just joked about, but it's these types of waiting that we begin, I think, to cry out to ourselves, and it's like, and to God, and we're like, God, why is this taking so long? Have you ever felt like that? Why is this taking so long, God? And I think that it's in that type of waiting that we begin to identify and find ourselves a little bit in the story of Joseph, because Joseph is one who was very familiar with that kind of waiting. He understood what it was like to wait in that way. When Joseph was 17, he was given a profound vision and dream from the Lord. And it was that he was going to be called to great leadership, great responsibility. He had a vision where he was standing tall and others were bowing down to him. And it may sound kind of arrogant or something, but it was a powerfully profound and even prophetic vision of his life. He was going to be given so much. So he was excited about that in his youth. He was 17, and he went and he told his family about it, his mom and his dad and his brothers. And instead of being happy for him and rejoicing with him, they got jealous, they were filled with hatred, and they threw him into a pit. After they threw him into a pit, they decided to lie about him and come up with this huge convoluted story that wasn't true. And they said he had died, but they had sold him into slavery in Egypt. And so Joseph has this great vision of his life, and he has this great calling on his life and these promises of his life, but yet he finds himself as a slave in Egypt. And so he's waiting, and he's waiting. And you get the picture, he's wondering, God, what are you doing? Why am I here in this other country, in this other land? And I'm so misunderstood, and I don't know what you're doing. And yet he waited, and God was moving, we see behind the scenes, and God was faithful, but he had to wait. Later on, he was waiting so long, he was being faithful, he was serving with integrity there in slavery, but he was falsely accused of sexual immorality. And when that happened, he got sent to prison wrongly. And so he waited, and he waited. And time just, I imagine it was so hard as he was in the prison experience for so long. Holding on to that dream that God had for his life, and yet not seeing any of it come to fruition. Year after year after year. Finally, one of the king's officials, a cupbearer, was in prison with him and had a crazy dream. And God gave Joseph the ability to interpret that dream. And he did, and what happened came to life. It was proven to be real. And so the cupbearer was so excited that there was this revelation of his life through Joseph that Joseph said, hey, cupbearer, whenever you get out of prison and you go back to Pharaoh, to the king's courts, remember me. It's like a glimpse into how desperate that Joseph was really wanting to see progress in his life. So the cupbearer gets out, goes into the king's courts, but forgets about Joseph. And so Joseph again is left waiting and waiting. And now we find ourselves in our text for today. If you have your Bible, you can open it up to Genesis chapter 41. And we're going to be going through the whole of this chapter. And I'm going to summarize half of it, but we're going to look at the other half pretty closely. It's a long chapter, and it's a really powerful and exciting story that we're climbing into today. So Joseph, he has nothing but his faith in God. His only resource is his knowledge of God's vision for his life and his faith. And we pick up here in verse 1 of chapter 41. We read, when 2 full years had passed, Pharaoh had a dream. And we'll stop there. When 2 full years had passed. How many years? 2. That's a long time. And what kind of years? Full years. Picture that with me for a second. 2 full years of being in prison, of being in the dungeon, of horrible food, of being smelly, of being misunderstood, of having no advocacy, of having no justice in your life, of wondering, of waiting, of longing for breakthrough. 2 full years had passed. Altogether, that adds up to around 13 years that Joseph had been waiting. Pharaoh has a dream. So here's Pharaoh. Let's continue. He was standing by the Nile when out of the river there came up 7 cows, sleek and fat, and they grazed among the reeds. After them, 7 other cows, ugly and gaunt, came up out of the Nile and stood beside those on the riverbank. And the cows that were ugly and gaunt ate up the 7 sleek fat cows. Then Pharaoh woke up. He fell asleep again and had a second dream. 7 heads of grain, healthy and good, were growing at a single stalk. After them, 7 other heads of grain sprouted, thin and scorched by the east wind. The thin heads of grain swallowed up the 7 healthy, full heads. Then Pharaoh woke up. It had been a dream. Verse 8. In the morning, when he woke up, his mind was troubled. And so he sent for all the magicians and wise men of Egypt. Pharaoh told them his dreams, but no one could interpret them for him. We'll pause there. Pharaoh, the most powerful person in the whole world at the time. Picture that. I mean, to be the Pharaoh in ancient Egypt was not to just be a ruler, it was like being a god. He commanded economies, armies, nations. His word was law. And whatever he said could go. He had every resource available to him in the entire world. He's the most powerful person in the world, and yet we find him here waking up from these dreams in a panic. And he's in a complete panic, and understandably, because these aren't just dreams. These are nightmares, aren't they? I mean, we just read through it sometimes and skip over it, but think about those dreams. He's standing by the Nile, and out of the water comes 7 big, fat cows. That's not a huge nightmare. That's just weird, but maybe not if you're back in the day. That would be a symbol of a lot of different things. But then the horror story begins. 7 skeletal cows, scrawny, just bones, ugly. Pharaoh says the ugliest he's ever seen in his life begin to come up out of the water. And they stand next to the beautiful cows, and then they begin to eat them. They devour them. This is a nightmare. This is horrific. And then the same thing happens with the wheat. Beautiful wheat, ugly wheat. The ugly wheat eats the beautiful wheat. And so Pharaoh doesn't know what to do at this point. He's terrified. And the most powerful man is now, like I said, in a deep panic. And so he calls all the wise men of Egypt to come together, all the magicians. No one can interpret his dreams at all. They have no clue. And suddenly Pharaoh's sense of great control is kind of just an illusion. And he has no power. He's controlled by this anxiety he's feeling because he knows that this isn't just a nightmare. There's something weightier to it. There's something to pay attention to here because he was giving it a lot of weight. So then let's continue in verse 9. Then the chief cupbearer said to Pharaoh, "Today I'm reminded of my shortcomings." Oh. Remember the cupbearer? This guy was in prison with Joseph before, and Joseph interpreted his dream, and he said he would remember, and he forgot. Oh, today I'm reminded of my shortcomings. Pharaoh was once angry with his servants. He imprisoned me and the chief baker in the house of the captain of the guard. Each of us had a dream on the same night, and each dream had a meaning of its own. Now a young Hebrew was there with us, a servant of the captain of the guard, and we told him our dreams, and he interpreted them for us, giving each man the interpretation of his dream. And things turned out exactly as he interpreted them to us. I was restored to my position, and the other man was impaled. So Pharaoh hears this, and he's pretty excited. Look at verse 14. Pharaoh sends for Joseph, and he was quickly brought from the dungeon. And when he had shaved and changed his clothes, he came before Pharaoh. Okay, this is one of those passages like in the scripture where we have to kind of slow down and picture it in our minds because there's lots happening in just a sentence or two. So think of yesterday. Pharaoh is in prison. Or even that morning, he's in prison. It's gross. There are no toilets there. There's no plumbing. The food's horrible. It's dark. He's hopeless. He's holding on to his faith in God, but it's a messy situation. And in just moments, he's standing before the most powerful person in the world. He literally goes from the prison to the palace in just a few moments. And they bathe him, and they shave him, and they clean him up because a Hebrew man would have had facial hair and a longer hair on his head, and they're preparing him, and now here he is. Huge transformation. Literally, prison, palace, all in just a moment. Verse 15. Pharaoh now says to Joseph, "Joseph, I had a dream, and no one can interpret it. But I've heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it." Joseph probably now looks over at cupbearer dude bro. Thanks for finally speaking up on my behalf. "I cannot do it," Joseph replied to Pharaoh, "but God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires." Now, that's a big deal. See, if I were standing before Pharaoh after 13 years of being falsely accused, mistreated, forgotten, abandoned, waiting on God, and suddenly I was brought from a dungeon and I got to stand before the most powerful person in the world, and he says, "Hey, there's something that I know that you can do for me. I think I would say, yeah, you're right, there's something I can do for you. And we can bargain right now. Like, I can interpret your dream, but it's going to mean that you give me some advocacy, that you let me out of prison, that you do something with me. Like, I need some justice here. But instead, Joseph simply says, I cannot do it. You're wrong. I can't interpret your dream. Can you imagine how courageous that is? He's like, but God. But God. And those are two words that we could just preach on and sit on all day. But God. That's the story of our lives. But God. But God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires. I'm not going to interpret your dream. God will. God will show you what's going on. So then Pharaoh says to Joseph, in my dream, I was standing at the bank of the Nile, and he goes on to just give the whole story. And then at that point, I think that after he tells Joseph the story, I just picture all these people in the room, and all eyes are just fixed on Joseph. And Pharaoh's like, okay, so what does this mean? And I love how it doesn't say anything about Joseph hesitating, saying, let me go think about it for a week, like, or negotiating or anything. No, he moves quickly, and he says this, the dreams of Pharaoh are one and the same. He has authority. He's just proclaiming and interpreting these dreams. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he's about to do. Now he's speaking it from God. The 7 good cows are 7 years. The 7 good heads of grain are 7 years. It's one and the same dream. The 7 lean, ugly cows that came up afterwards are 7 years, and so are the 7 worthless heads of grain scorched by the east wind. They are 7 years of famine. It is just as I said to Pharaoh, God has shown Pharaoh what he's about to do. 7 years of great abundance are coming through the land of Egypt, but 7 years of famine will follow them. Then all the abundance in Egypt will be forgotten, and the famine will ravage the land. The abundance in the land will not be remembered because the famine that follows it will be so severe. The reason the dream was given to Pharaoh in 2 forms is that the matter has been firmly decided by God, and God will do it soon. There's authority in that, isn't there? So he's interpreting it, and he's saying, basically, and it's straightforward, there's going to be 7 years of incredible abundance. Like, Egypt is going to be more prosperous than ever. It's going to be an incredible season. But then there's going to be 7 years of such famine and hardship that no one's even going to remember the 7 years of prosperity. And then he ends it by kind of nailing it into the God. He says, just putting a nail in it, he says, and there are 2 different pictures of this because God is declaring it. This is what God's going to do. God will do it soon. He's not sugarcoating anything. And then he goes on in verse 33. And so now he's not just interpreting dreams. Now he's like giving leadership to Pharaoh. Now let Pharaoh look for a discerning and wise man and put him in charge of the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh appoint commissioners over the land to take 1/5 of the harvest of Egypt during the 7 years of abundance. They should collect all the food of those good years that are coming up and store up the grain under the authority of Pharaoh to be kept in the cities for food. This food should be held in reserve for the country so it could be used during the 7 years of famine that will come up upon Egypt so that the country may not be ruined by the famine. The plan seemed good to Pharaoh and to all his officials. So basically, Joseph is saying, look, here's what you have to do. This is going to be 14 years. This is 7 years of prosperity, 7 years of famine. You need to find a very wise leader who can lead the people. You need to appoint all these commissioners over just for different regions. You need to implement like a 20% tax over all the grain so that it can be stored. You need to have storage cities and silos where the grain can be stored. And you have to do all of this so that the world can be saved. Like he's just going off with this great authority in this place. Now, the plan seemed good to Pharaoh and to all his officials, verse 38. So Pharaoh asked them all, can we find anyone like this man in whom is the Spirit of God? That's incredible. Pharaoh was thought to be a god by his own people, and he's recognizing now Joseph's true God, the one true living God. So can we find anyone like this person who's filled with the Spirit of God? So Pharaoh says, Joseph, since God made all this known to you, there's no one so discerning and wise as you. You shall be in charge of my palace, and all my people are to submit to your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you. And he goes on, verse 41, so Pharaoh said to Joseph, I hereby put you in charge of the whole land of Egypt. And Pharaoh took his signet ring, symbolizing all the power of the king. And he took it from his finger and put it on Joseph's finger. And he dressed him in robes of fine linen and put a gold chain around his neck. And he made him ride in a chariot as his second in command. And people shouted before him, make way. Thus he put him in charge of the whole land of Egypt. Isn't that amazing? What a powerful story. And it all just happened like in those few moments. From the prison straight up to this point in the palace. After 13 years of waiting, he's in this place now where his boyhood dream begins to be realized and begins to take effect. And he's clothed in this beautiful robe, and suddenly he's riding around in a chariot, and you get the picture. In an instant, this forgotten prisoner becomes the second most powerful person in all of the land. And what happened is, just as Joseph had predicted, the famine came, or the years of prosperity came first. And it was 7 years of riches, of abundance. And it said there was so much grain that Joseph even counted it all. It was like sand on the seashore. There were so many. And he stored it all away. And as the chapter goes on, I'm just paraphrasing here, he goes on to say how then the years of famine struck. And it was bad. It was so bad it wasn't just in Egypt. It was all around. Nations all over. And as the panic began to set in and the hunger began to set in, people would go to Pharaoh and say, what do we do? And look at the next verse. It says this, when all of Egypt began to feel the famine, people cried to Pharaoh for food. And what does Pharaoh tell them? Go to Joseph and do what he tells you to do. And then we go to the verse 57. Eventually, all the world came to Egypt to buy grain from Joseph because the famine was that severe everywhere. So we see just the incredible waiting that Joseph has been doing, and we see the promises of God begin to unfold, and we see God just working in incredible ways, transforming Joseph's life and the lives of so many people. And like I said, we're kind of in the middle of some of this story of Joseph. But I get the privilege of reading this part of the story today that just is so full of life as he moves from the dungeon straight into this place of second in command of the entire world. So that's the look at the text. And we've talked a lot about Joseph now. So now I want to talk a little bit about you and me. Because we can find ourselves in this story. And I don't know what stuck out to you during this time as we've just been looking through it some. But Joseph's story can teach us a lot about our own. And so as I've reflected on this passage, there are so many things we could pull out of it. But there are three things I just want us to look at in the time that we have left and try to bring some application, some takeaways that will hopefully help some. And the first is this, that in a season of waiting, it's really important to surrender. To surrender. And not just to surrender, but to surrender your pride in the waiting. Surrender your pride. See, when we're in a season of waiting, if you're like me, in a time of waiting, there are a lot of different emotions that we start to feel. God gives us vision, or there's something we're waiting for, and we're in this season. We like to have control. We like to have a sense of entitlement. We like to make things happen on our own. We're very productive people, most of us. And yet there's something about the season of waiting that teaches us patience. It teaches us constraint. It teaches us humility. And there are so many things in life that flow directly from being humble, being in a humble posture. And it's one of the last things we want to do whenever we're in a place of really experiencing the uncertainty of waiting, but to surrender. One thing that really struck me this week is I was thinking it's really important, and what I tend to do in seasons of waiting is just realize, okay, I have no control. I can't really rely on myself a lot, but I can be really patient. So I'm just going to be patient in the waiting. But then I felt like this week God was really showing me that there's a big difference between being patient and surrendering. Being patient means I'm putting up with something, and I'm like holding on to it, and I'm like, ugh. That's the kind of waiting we talked about earlier. It's like, come on, person with the accelerator challenged foot. Like, get going. Like, none of us want to be on the 405 doing nothing. And that requires patience. But the kind of waiting on the things I'm talking about, when I'm talking about like all these other examples of the big things of waiting, no, it's about surrendering and kind of bowing before God and saying, Lord, I don't understand what's going on right now. And I'm not going to try to figure it all out and take it into my own hands and say that I have a sense of entitlement and that I need to be making these things happen and figure it all out myself. Instead, I'm going to surrender to what you're doing. And that's a hard discipline to do. But it's something that really, really develops character in us. And particularly, it develops humility. Humility is vital. It's one of the keys of following Jesus. It's one of the key elements of our formation as spiritually flourishing people. And so when you find yourself in a series like that, surrendering is a really important thing to do. I think of a time when my family and I were getting ready to move into a home. And there was a time when some provision came and the market went down, and this is years ago before things were like they were right now. And we felt like, okay, God has actually told us in some ways through family and friends and parents and pastors and mentors that we're going to make a move into a different living situation. And so I got really excited. And I went to different websites and I started looking at houses. We had a couple of needs. We needed like at least 2 bedrooms, and we needed a place for my wife to teach music. And so we started looking around at all these different places, and a door closed. We'd find the right place, a door would close. We'd find the right place, the door would close. We'd find something that was just miraculous that we could qualify for, which is absurd in this world, but then the door closed. And we waited and waited and waited, and pretty soon I got really mad, and I was like, I can take this into my own hands. Like, we don't have to have 3 bedrooms. We could have 1 bedroom, and I'll put my kids in like the attic. We'll figure this out. My wife can teach piano in the living room. She doesn't have to teach it like in some studio in the back. I just want to get a house. I'm going to make this happen. And doors closed, thankfully, for that. And then in the meantime, I'm wondering, like, God, why would you tease me? Why would you like show me? You're like telling me, my dad's calling me, all these people are coming into my life saying, you are about to make a big move. And yet door after door after door after door closed. And you know what, guys? It wasn't until the point when I finally threw my hands up in the air and was like, forget it, God. I don't know what you're doing, but this city's big, and I don't have enough money, and I don't know how this is ever going to happen. And it was like 15 minutes later, after doing that my dad called and said, you need to go look at a house on this particular street. And then our old lead pastor, Brad, called me and said, you need to go look at a house on a particular street. So I drove over to that particular street, and as I was driving by that street, a realtor was putting a sign out in front of that legit house. And we closed 11 days later. And it was amazing. And it has more than what we ever even wanted. But it came after that point of surrender to God. And that's like a material thing. It's a house. It was in a different season. I would never buy a house in this, not that I wouldn't buy a house right now, but I never could. But wait and surrender and trust in the Lord, okay? Number two is this. As you wait, there's a lot you can be doing, so prepare. Prepare faithfully as you wait. Sometimes, as we wait, I think it's really easy to just zone out, kind of get numb. Like, I don't know what God's doing. I don't know what's next. I'm in this season of waiting, whether it's for a relationship or a job or whatever. You can kind of detach. But what I think is really powerful that we see in the life of Joseph is he prepared really well while he was waiting. He prepared in the meantime. It was during that time, and we looked at a lot of this last week, when Pastor Jesse, a guest pastor, was speaking to us, and it was powerful. And it was about how in the middle season of while we're waiting, there's so much that can be cultivated that can happen. It was in those years of prison that Joseph began to learn faithfulness. He was faithful in small things when he was in Potiphar's house. He learned how to be faithful in small things so that he could later be faithful with bigger things. This is a principle that Jesus tells us from the Gospel of Luke, that if you're faithful with little, you will be given much. And so there's so much you can do in the process. And I think this is important for us because of a few things. One, LA is a very fluid culture with a lot of people coming in and out. And as a pastor for like 20 years in this city, in this church on the west side, I've seen such fluidity. And there's a common thread that it's kind of actually changing in the last few months, it seems, with some of you in this room. But so often there are people that come to the church, they come to seek God, and they're thinking like, I really want to see God do amazing things in my life, but I may not be in LA for more than like a year. Or I'm in LA, but I'm renting, and I don't really know that I'm going to ever not rent, and I don't really want to do much because LA is just like a fluid passing zone. You're just here for a season to see what happens. But like, get me back to Nebraska or Nashville or the suburbs or something because the west side's kind of crazy. I think it's pretty amazing, but a lot of times that's how we feel. And one of the things that can happen in that is there's a passivity, and we don't live where we are. But you're not going to ever bloom if you're not planted. You don't grow if you're not planted. So even if you're in a situation that you're only here for like a year, do you know what you can do? There are so many different things that you can sow your life into in faithfulness, even right here and now. So one of the beautiful things I've seen in the last few months is some of you in this room even, you've just come. And one of the second, third, fourth week, you guys, there are a lot of people that are doing this right now. 2, 3, 4 weeks of being here at the church, because we have a lot of new people right now, and we're so excited that you're here. People are telling us, they're telling Brianne, me, Pastor Megan, Josh, others, like, we're ready to serve. I don't know if it's certain. I don't know if I'm going to buy a house across the street and give my life to the Vineyard, but in this season, I'm going to serve. I want to grow. I'm going to invest myself while I'm here because I'm going to water this grass and see what can happen. And as that happens, instant connection starts to happen. Relationships start to happen. The loneliness you experience begins to be fulfilled as community begins to be developed. You start to actually love the church. You love the city. So many things can happen as you're faithful just right where you are. And it's not just in terms of serving in the church. You can use this time to prepare in a lot of ways. For instance, if you're longing to be married, as you're waiting, are you becoming the type of person that a spouse would want to be married to? If you're waiting for financial breakthrough in your life, are you stewarding the resources God's given you right now with generosity and faithfulness? Because you have to be faithful in the little things before you're given more. This is something that my very first pastor taught me when I was in college. I had a dream. It wasn't like Joseph's, but I was a music major in college. I was studying jazz saxophone and other things, and I remember feeling like a real call to this type of pastoral ministry, and I felt like God was calling me to vocational ministry, as a pastor. And so I went and I told my pastor that. And he said, that's great. I need you to show up at 5:30 on Sunday mornings. And I said, why? Am I going to get to learn how to preach? Am I going to get to study the Bible with you? Are you going to pray for me? Are you going to let me into your study and tell me stories and I'm going to be your friend? No. He was like, no, I need you to transform the building that we meet in from the preschool that it is during the week into the sanctuary it needs to be on Sunday morning. This is in Wisconsin at 5:30 in the morning in the winter. I needed a blowtorch to even open the door handle on my car. It was frozen shut sometimes. But I would do that, and I had to get in my car and go on the ice. And I was the very first person at the church sometimes, 21 years old, trying to figure out what to do. And I just remember Pastor Bill always telling me, you have to be faithful in the little things. You have to be faithful in the little things. And there could be such a huge calling on your life, and you can be waiting for such incredible breakthrough in your life. But if you're not willing to stand in the parking lot with the stop sign and welcome new people as they pull their cars in, you're gonna delay God's purpose flowing from you because of your stubbornness and because of your pride. It's so important to prepare and be faithful in these times of waiting. See, God wasn't just preparing a position for Joseph all through these chapters. He was preparing Joseph for the position. And the reason Joseph was able to just speak to Potiphar, or speak rather to Pharaoh with such authority, is because he had all those years of being humble, of being faithful, of being a servant, of listening to God, of practicing dream interpretation through the cupbearer. And when his moment came, he was fully ready. All right, and number 3, trust. Trust that your waiting is not wasted. That your waiting is not wasted. I mean, sometimes we think that the waiting is just the in-between. It's just pointless. Get me from here to there. The destination is the goal. But this is something that really has touched me that I read a long time ago. What God desires to do while we wait is just as important as what we're waiting for. Let me say that again. What God wants to do in us while we wait might just be as important as what it is that we're waiting for. Because it's in that process of waiting that God is doing incredible things, and we need to trust that our waiting isn't wasted, that can be some of the most precious things that are happening in our lives. Romans 8:28 says, in all things, God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. And so we have to trust that God's plan is bigger than anything we could see. See, when Joseph was in Potiphar's house as a slave, he didn't see the fullness of God's plan there. He had a vision, but he didn't see the fullness of it there. He saw part of it, and he was faithful, but he didn't see it all. When he was in prison, he didn't see the fullness of it. It's only now that he's beginning to see some of the fullness of it as he's riding on that chariot. He's beginning to see it now. He has to trust that, God, you were doing something bigger than I ever could have imagined. Because while I wanted you to raise me up, I don't think he had any idea that God wanted to actually save Egypt through him. God wanted to bring grain to the world through him. There was a much, much, much bigger plan. And so take encouragement for that today, that while you're waiting, God is doing so much. It's been said, waiting is not wasted. Instead, it's like a training season. There's so much that's going on. I remember one time there was an illness in my family, and it was a really difficult situation I was in. I was scared, someone I dearly loved, and it kind of shook me to the core. And it was a time when I was longing to see breakthrough and healing in this family member's life. And so we prayed together as a family, and this is my mom who was diagnosed with a cancer years ago. And it was one of the scariest times of my life because the prognosis was really crazy. Well, as time went on, we were waiting, and many of you know what that's like, just a long, patient kind of suffering of enduring through uncertainty. It's wondering, when's the diagnosis going to come? What is that phone call going to mean? What is the doctor going to say at this next meeting? Like every little pain, it might be like some type of metastasis. Like, what is this? And it was just a time of such great anxiety. Well, through those years, or through those several months, rather, of my mom's illness, I didn't really know what was going on. It was kind of a cloud to me. I couldn't figure it all out. But later on, my mom had a surgery, and God brought healing to her life, and she's been cancer-free for over 20 or more years. But one of the fascinating things, you know what happened during that season? I looked back later, just like Joseph can look back now and be like, oh, I know why I needed to interpret that cupbearer's dream, so I could interpret Pharaoh's, rather. I looked back at my life and I realized, you know what was happening in that season when my mom was ill? My dad came to know the Lord. He saw the church gather around and love my mom and pray for her healing. There was a season when my sister was grieving and struggling so much that she started getting involved in a community that brought her some of the best friends of her life that eventually led her to her husband. And so there's so much that happens as we are just simply trusting that we can't see the full picture, but that's why we have a God, that's why we serve the Lord Jesus. Because our God does see the whole picture. He's in control. He's faithful. And so we surrender and we trust and we serve faithfully. We practice while we're in the midst of it all. So does that make sense? So today, I think what I would want to encourage you with is a scripture that really struck me this week. Because waiting, if we're honest, waiting is really hard. And it gets emotional even thinking about, because I know some of you in this room have been waiting for some things for a really long time. Some of you, it's a lot, and it's very real. And there's a lot you're really waiting for, and it's not easy. But Psalm 27 of David just struck me this week. David says something so beautiful. He says, I remain confident of this, that I will see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. That's my prayer for you guys today, that you can remain confident of this, that you will see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. So wait for the Lord, you guys. Be strong and take heart and wait for the Lord. See, waiting isn't passive. It's not just patience. It's a very active thing that we do. It requires trust. It requires strength. It requires taking heart. So what are you waiting for this morning? Where do you find yourself? I want us to take a few moments in just silence right where we are. We can maybe go in our minds. If you're comfortable, we'll do a little imaginative exercise for a moment. And then we're going to have a minute to pray. And then the worship team is going to come, and Pastor Josh is going to lead us in a time of response. But just right where you are, because there's a lot that we've been looking at. Would you just close your eyes? I want you to picture yourself in the dungeon. Picture those prison walls, the darkness, the despair, the sense of being alone, of waiting. And now let me ask you this. What's that prison for you? What are you waiting for? What's the context you're in? Is it for a relationship? Is it for work? Is it for breakthrough spiritually? And I want you to picture that in the midst of the waiting, that God is present. He's very real. He sees you. He knows you. He's called you. He's with you. What's he saying? What is he desiring to do? For some of you, God is just calling you to surrender to his timing. To surrender to his timing. To trust that he's working even though you're in this dark space. And some of you are probably holding on to self-reliance or pride, and you're just holding on and clinging to it. And God is saying, no, surrender. Let it go. Let it go. For some, God is just reminding you, be faithful right where you are. And there are many of you that are in that season of waiting right now, and And you're on one of the three sides of it. You're either like, you have a vision and a dream and you're just kind of at the beginning and you're full of excitement. Others of you are just right there in the midst of that dungeon of waiting and really wanting to believe that your story can end like Joseph's in this place, but you're in the dungeon right now. And you're listening to the call to be faithful, but you're in the dungeon right now. And others of you maybe are in a place where you feel like you've been released from that and the dreams have already been taken into fruition. You're kind of like Joseph who's in the palace. But those three different groups, if you identify with any of those three groups right now, I want to ask you just to stand where you are, and I want to pray. If that's you in any of those groups, because I want to pray different things for each one of you. And those of you who don't stand, you can just pray for those who are standing around you. For those of you who feel like you identify with Joseph in the sense that you feel like maybe in your life you've gone from the prison to the palace recently and you're filled with joy. You're rejoicing because God has broken through in your life and what you've been waiting for has come. Then this is a time in the next few minutes when we respond for you to be rejoicing and thanking Jesus. Give him thanks. Give him praise for his goodness and faithfulness. Remember his goodness and his faithfulness in this time. And give him thanks. And for you, it's space to sing and to shout and to even dance before God, to express your gratitude. Others of you are just in the beginning, and you have that vision. And others of you are in this difficult place in the middle. And I would just want to pray this over those two groups, that you would wait for the Lord and that you would be strong. And so I want to pray for strength. And actually, in the next few minutes, as Jacob begins to lead us into this time, if you feel like in this time, like we need to be patient and we need to do all these things, but we also need strength. And that's something that comes also through the grace of God, through the power of his Spirit. And so I want to pray for some of you just to be infused with the strength of God for the kind of dungeon experience that you may be in right now. Is that anyone? I want to ask you to come forward if you just want prayer for strength. And right up in this front space, people from our prayer team are just going to lay hands on you and not to get in a conversation or anything. They're just going to say, give them strength, Lord. Give them strength. Give them hope. Give them more of your Holy Spirit so that they can be strong and take heart and wait on the Lord. Is that anybody? It's too dark. I can't really see, so don't lift your hands, but you can respond by just coming down here. I would think it's a few of us. And I'm doing this not because there's something magical in this space, but because we want to pray for you, because we love you, we care for you. Say, God, would you give our brothers and sisters strength today? Come all the way down to the front. This is the opportunity for this right now, you guys, all the way down. And now if you're on our prayer team, you come around these people and they're going to just kind of put their hand behind you or over your head, and they're just going to be asking God to bring strength, like an infusion of the strength of God in your life, an infusion of the Holy Spirit, a filling of the Spirit for what you're waiting for, because this time of waiting is just as important as what it is that you're waiting for. And God, these want to be faithful. These want to be secure right now. They want to be rooted. They want to wait well. They want to have strength in this time. They want to have hope in this time. But Lord, they get weary, they get tempted, they get tired, they get distracted. It's easy to be hopeless, not hopeful. So God, we ask for the power and presence of your Holy Spirit right now on my brothers and sisters, on my friends. We need more people to come lay hands and just bless and pray. So if you're an elder or a staff member, would you come around, just move about this place, asking the Holy Spirit to come and fill